1987. Shortly after midnight, two teenage boys armed with a flashlight and a .22 caliber rifle go late-night hunting around their hometown of Alexander, Arkansas. The boys, 16-year-old Don Henry and 17-year-old Kevin Ives, would never make it back home. Beaten, murdered, and then later placed on railroad tracks so their bodies would be mangled by an oncoming freight train. The brutal and mysterious deaths would expose a cover-up by the local prosecutor, leading researchers into a rabbit hole involving international drug smuggling, the Medellin cartel, 3 U.S. presidents, and the CIA. July 1st, 1972. A DC-4 airplane carrying over 13,000 pounds of explosives is seized at a regional airport in Louisiana, allegedly conspiring to smuggle these explosives into Mexico to aid in the overthrow of Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro. 9 suspects are arrested in connection to the plane. One of those arrested is 33-year-old Louisiana resident and professional TWA pilot Barry Seal. Barry was a prodigy, getting his pilot license at just 16. His piloting skills were so remarkable, his own mentor regarded him as being a first cousin to a bird. After leaving high school, Barry would begin flying for the U.S. military, where he furthered his already exceptional skills as a member of the 82nd Airborne Green Berets. In 1964, while still serving in the military, Seal also began working as a commercial pilot for Howard Hughes' Trans World Airlines, a position he held at the time of his arrest. After being arrested and held on a $50,000 bond, the case against Barry would end up being dismissed after the government prosecutor tried to submit an AR-180 rifle as trial evidence. This rifle was inadmissible. It had nothing at all to do with the charges, leading the U.S. Court of Appeals to call this act intentional misconduct by the government, almost as if the prosecutor was trying to throw the case on purpose. Well, according to Barry himself, his colleagues and his family, in between receiving his pilot license in 1955 and his arrest in 72, Barry had begun working as a CIA contract pilot, allegedly involved in not only the Bay of Pigs invasion and covert operations in Asia, but also in piloting a getaway plane out of Dallas the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. While there's no official evidence or confirmation of this, outside of the fact he was a Special Forces pilot with a secret level clearance, his 1972 arrest serves as the earliest concrete indication that Barry's motives aligned directly with those of the agency. 1977. A crop duster from Hazen, Arkansas, named Gary Betzner, is driving to go get ice cream with his wife and young daughter. While driving, his car breaks down over the White River Bridge. Betzner gets out of his El Camino, opens the hood, and then suddenly ends his own life by jumping off the side of the bridge. He'll be back. 2 years later, the Sandinistas, a left-wing guerrilla group backed by communist nations, successfully overthrow the CIA-backed Somoza regime in Nicaragua. Ronald Reagan announces his presidential campaign with a promise to assist anti-communist movements around the globe, and 1 month later, a local narcotics unit, in collaboration with the United States Drug Enforcement Agency, search Barry Seal's airplane when he lands at Golesen International Airport in Honduras. The narcotics unit was expecting to find 100 kilos of cocaine aboard. No drugs are found. Only an AR-180 rifle is discovered. This rifle gets Barry and his co-pilot arrested. After not finding any drugs aboard the aircraft, the DEA instructs the narcotics unit to check Barry's plane tires for mud. This would lead to the revelation that earlier that day, Seal had landed at an island off the coast of Honduras, where one passenger departed the plane carrying a large green duffel bag. 3 days later, on December 15th, members of that narcotics unit locate this departed passenger, who is then arrested for 17.5 kilos of cocaine. Now facing both gun and drug charges, Barry Seal would spend the next 7 months imprisoned. But on July 28th, 1980, he's freed on lack of evidence. Barry himself claims he had to actually bribe his way out of jail. On his flight back home aboard a commercial airplane, Barry finds himself seated next to international drug smuggler Roger Reeves. It would be through Reeves that Barry would connect with Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, or the Medellin cartel.
Now listen to me. All the people you ever heard of freebasing, have you ever heard of anybody blowing up?
The early 1980s marked a new chapter in how cocaine was viewed in America. It wasn't just a substance anymore. It was a symbol, the social drug of the elite.
Park coke? Yeah, I do park coke.
With films like Scarface making it cool to do coke, the drug becomes a cultural phenomenon. Cocaine was everywhere, from the nightclubs of Los Angeles to the high-powered offices of Wall Street. And one of the most pivotal figures in this rapidly growing drug trade was Barry. After connecting with Pablo Escobar, Barry had begun flying cocaine into Louisiana and had a system where he would parachute the cocaine in remote areas of the Louisiana swamp to be picked up by a helicopter ground team who would then bring the drugs to the distributors. According to Barry himself, in the early 1980s, he was making over $1.5 million every trip. And according to the DEA, Barry's organization had over 19 aircraft, 2 ocean-going vessels equipped with helipads, and at its peak employed around 60 people. Although Barry lived and initially operated in Louisiana, sometime around late 1980, he would move all of his critical smuggling operations, particularly his aircraft, to the Mena Airport in Mena, Arkansas. Mena's remote location offered more security away from the surveillance of law enforcement agencies in Louisiana. The Louisiana State Police had been out to get Seal since his involvement in the 1972 sting operation that got thrown out over the rifle, even at one point fining him $5,000 for accidentally hitting a power line while transporting a mall Santa Claus. Seal liked the fact he was evading police. He allegedly ran into a state police agent on the streets of Baton Rouge and started making fun of the department's efforts to catch him doing something illegal.
This cop's stupid as fuck.
He would also routinely wave at police agents spying on him, and once in 1977 tried to pull over a Louisiana State Police trooper for speeding. To put Barry's move into perspective, in 1980, Baton Rouge, where Barry lived, was home to around 200,000 people. Mena's population was around 5,000. On top of this, Barry's partner Roger Reeves said while Barry still lived in Louisiana, he insisted on operating out of Mena, Arkansas, because he, quote, couldn't be caught, that it was impossible for Barry to be arrested while in Mena. This luxury, though, would come at a price of $125,000 every time he landed, the money presumably moving through local government officials. Barry also made frequent references to having lunch and dinner with the governor of Arkansas, then future President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's bodyguard, Arkansas State Trooper L.D. Brown, would also confirm Barry Seal's relationship with Bill. But operating out of Mena would bring about its own problems. Both the FBI and the DEA had been watching Barry since at least the late 70s, and not only had extensive knowledge of his drug smuggling, but even went as far as 2 wiretap payphones he was known to use. IRS agent William Duncan managed to get testimony from individuals around Mena directly involved with laundering Seal's drug profits. He, along with Arkansas State Police investigator Russell Welch, who was investigating Barry's operations in Mena, had more than enough evidence to move forward with indictments. But no matter what they found, no indictments would ever come, allegedly stonewalled by then Western Arkansas U.S. Attorney Asa Hutchinson. Russell Welch in particular had concluded that Barry was smuggling weapons to Nicaragua and being allowed as a reward to fly back into America with a load of cocaine. Welch claims that 2 FBI agents told him to ignore these findings.
The FBI agents, Tom Ross and Floyd Hayes, when I thought they were trying to tell me of something illegal going on without telling me what to do with it, I assumed that they wanted me to monitor and investigate. It turned out to be eventually was that they were telling me to ignore.
In 1982, Congress passes the Boland Amendment, the first in a series of legislative actions designed to stop the Reagan administration and the CIA from supporting the Nicaraguan Contras. The Contras were a faction of right-wing rebel groups, opposing the new socialist Sandinista government that assumed power following the end of the Somoza regime. President Reagan, who despised the Sandinistas, once called the Contras the moral equivalent of America's founding fathers. However, this amendment was passed by Congress because of growing foreign policy concerns regarding the U.S. interjecting into an ongoing civil war and the Contras' involvement regarding human rights abuses. Around this time, a friend of Barry Seal's from high school, named Kenneth Webb, was contacted by Louisiana State Police. The Louisiana State Police coerced Webb to work for them in capturing Barry Seal. They threatened that if he would not cooperate, they would essentially make up charges such as conspiracy to ruin his life. At the time, Kenneth wasn't even living in Louisiana, but under the threat of having his life ruined, Webb returned to his home state in early 1983 and began working for Barry Seal as an informant for the state police. According to Kenneth Webb, there were multiple instances of the Louisiana State Police lying about his experience working with Seal and reporting these lies to the DEA.
I was shown a stack of reports that I supposedly had made. And I was just told to initial each page and not, read it. Well, I began to read, spot read, and I saw things there that I was supposed to have said and done or seen or whatever, which were not true. Absolutely lies. One of the secretaries brought one of Mr. Seal's associates and I a box of plain white box, okay, donuts. And when I read that in the DEA report, it was nothing like that at all. The box was supposed to have been taped and double taped. I opened it and I saw drugs. And I don't even know what drugs look like. I mean, I saw drugs in there. And this was in a report. And so I objected, and I was told to shut up. I was told that I needed to remember the original deal that I was told about, and shut up, in other words.
Who told you this?
Several different agents. Lieutenant Butch Mullen, of Lieutenant Narcotics and Sergeant Jack Krenninger.
At the same time, Seal was also indicted in South Florida for attempting to smuggle in 1,200 pounds of methaqualone pills, famously known as Quaaludes. And in 1982,
the U.S. government Schedule 1 them. No shit. You can't even buy them anymore.
But Seal himself wasn't actually arrested. It was two pilots he employed that, when given the opportunity, flipped on Berry to avoid a jail sentence. Seal was found guilty in Florida in February of 1984 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But Berry, attempting to avoid his significant prison time, gets out on an appeal bond and immediately decides to become a witness. A month earlier, the CIA, with approval from the Reagan administration, had begun mining Nicaraguan harbors to disrupt the Sandinistas' ability to receive aid. The news of the CIA's mining operations resulted in intense scrutiny from the media. It also resulted in the Sandinista government suing the United States at the International Court of Justice, which ruled in the favor of Nicaragua, citing violations of international law. The US rejected the court's rulings, arguing that its actions were part of a legitimate defense strategy against the spread of Soviet influence in the Western Hemisphere. Congress also passed a second Boland Amendment to stop Reagan from further abusing loopholes from the first. In the middle of all of this, Barry Seal was trying his best to become an informant. After the DEA laughs at his offer to cooperate under little to no supervision, Barry reaches out to a U.S. attorney in Baton Rouge, Stan Bardswell, somebody Barry knew from grade school. Bardswell declined to even meet with Seal, calling his request too cryptic. Louisiana State Police agents would later say they were confused as to why Bardswell didn't accept Seal's offer. So, running out of options, Barry turns to his lawyer, Richard Veneste. In March, Veneste gets Barry in contact with Vice President George Bush and the Federal Drug Task Force, who, quote, embraced him as an undercover informant. Veneste would later go on to be the Democrats' chief counsel on the Senate Whitewater investigation, where there he defended Bill Clinton against allegations of wrongdoing. He would also strangely later deny that he ever helped Barry Seal become a government informant, contradicting earlier statements he made to the Wall Street Journal. Barry, now in contact with the Vice President's Drug Task Force, flies to DC and discusses his smuggling operations, the millions he was making smuggling cocaine into the United States, and his work with the Medellin cartel. But what really caught the attention of George H.W. Bush and the Federal Drug Task Force was Seal's claims that the Sandinista government in Nicaragua was participating in the cocaine trade. According to Seal, Escobar and the Medellin cartel had arranged to share a portion of their drug profits with the Sandinistas in exchange for use of an airfield in Managua. President Reagan, after the Boland Amendment, was still looking for any way to grow public support for the Nicaraguan Contras, and for potentially being able to provide evidence of the Sandinistas aiding drug smugglers down in Nicaragua. Barry Seal finessed his way out of his Florida charges. He went from major drug smuggling felon to star informant overnight. Barry, now working directly with the DEA and the Florida Drug Task Force on federal orders, gets in contact with Jorge Ochoa and makes a deal to move 3,000 kilos of cocaine into America. Arrangements are made to get Barry's favorite plane, the Fat Lady, outfitted with cameras to capture evidence against members of the cartel. These cameras would end up being installed by CIA technicians, and what would follow has been labeled the greatest undercover operation in the DEA's history.
Is there anyone out there who still isn't clear about what doing drugs does? Okay, last time.
On June 24th, 1984, Barry Seal flies his beloved C-123 aircraft down to the Los Brasilia civilian airfield in Nicaragua. During the pickup, the CIA camera successfully photographed Seal, Pablo Escobar, and Jose Gacha of the Medellin cartel, and a man named Frederico Vaughn, loading cocaine onto the aircraft. These classified photos provided concrete evidence of Escobar's involvement in drug trafficking, and also implicated the Nicaraguan government in the drug trade, as Frederico Vaughn was said to have been an aide to one of the top officials in the socialist Sandinista government. After successfully transporting the plane load of cocaine to Homestead Air Force Base in Miami, drug agents began taking control of the shipment, and within days, Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, Frederico Vaughn, and 8 others are indicted, charged with drug trafficking, and are officially wanted by the US government. The initial DEA plan was to keep these photos classified, blame the missing drugs on the drivers being arrested to cover for Barry, and to have Barry continue to work with the cartel in hopes to eventually arrest the leaders in an area where extradition would be easier. But within 3 weeks, news of this operation is leaked to the press, and the cartel, now realizing that Barry Seal has turned on them, put a 6-figure bounty on his head. By this time, it's estimated that sales of crack cocaine in the United States had surpassed the sales of all other drugs, including marijuana. When dealers went from selling cocaine to selling crack, the drug exploded. Turning coke into crack was a fairly simple process that had extremely dramatic effects. Crack was more readily available to use, almost like smoking a cigarette, something you could do in your car on the way to work. You'd start to feel the effects almost immediately after smoking it. Crack was more pure than coke, so the effects were amplified, and most importantly, it was extremely cheap. You no longer needed $50 or $100 to get high. You only needed $5. There were even some dealers selling $1 hits. Crack essentially democratized cocaine in America, with over 2% of Americans at the time admitting they use cocaine or crack cocaine on a regular basis. And with the influx of users came an influx of dealers.
Just get a job, they say. You could be like Calvin.
There is something different about him. Wonder where he's working. Welcome to McDonald's. May I help you?
That was minimum wage, $3.35 an hour. And then the government taking taxes out of that. My man came to me and he said, I gotta wait for you to make some money.
Come in. Come, spend the rest of your money.
This is what we were waiting for. It was like the gold rush. It was like a gold rush that hit the hood. Fuck Calvin, man.
Kids as young as 15 and 16 were essentially becoming drug kingpins overnight. But it's important to note that the public knowledge regarding the harmful effects of crack cocaine were still emerging. In the early 80s, cocaine was viewed as relatively safe. One could argue, as Barry Seal did, that he didn't know the harmful effects his trafficking would cause in part on American citizens. There really was almost no way of knowing the impact that crack would have.
Somebody gotta do it. Might as well be me that capitalized off of it.
Now with his cover blown, Barry Seal could no longer go back to Nicaragua for his own safety. While the DEA and the Florida Drug Task Force took Barry Seal on as a witness and coordinated the covert operation, he was still being actively investigated by the Louisiana and Arkansas authorities. And in October of '84, a grand jury in Louisiana begins interviewing witnesses against Seal. One of those witnesses is Kenneth Webb, who under his own admission lies to the federal grand jury about the work he did with Seal.
Have you appeared before a grand jury?
Yes.
Did you tell the grand jury the truth?
No.
By admitting that he lied to a federal grand jury, Ken Webb is confessing to a felony crime, perjury.
The federal grand judge would end up rejecting Webb's request to recant his testimony. In November, federal and state officials investigating Barry Seal in Florida and Louisiana meet twice to try and settle differences between agencies. While Barry did manage to work his way out of his Florida charges thanks to his undercover work, authorities in Louisiana were still out to convict him on every charge they could. Florida officials wanted Seal to testify against other smugglers down in Florida, and helping Barry get out of his Louisiana charges seemed like a pretty good way to secure his testimony. Officials in Arkansas were still being stonewalled because that state is a fucking mess. To try and combat the accusations levied against him in the Louisiana grand jury, Seal had reached out to a local Baton Rouge reporter and filmed an hour-long special that aired in November of 1984. The special goes into detail about his work with the DEA, his undercover operation down in Nicaragua, and the charges being stacked against him. In the special, Seal denies ever trafficking drugs outside of this covert operation and simply says he's an aviation consultant that the Louisiana State Police is targeting for personal reasons. After the second meeting between Louisiana and Florida officials, they come to an agreement in December of '84. The Louisiana Drug Task Force would permit Barry to continue working with Florida authorities, as he was said to be the primary witness on multiple drug cases, and had agreed to impose on Seal only the maximum sentence he would receive in Florida, with both sentences running concurrently. No matter what he was convicted for in Louisiana, he would receive no additional prison time. Barry had already been sentenced to 10 years in Florida, but after getting out on the appeal bond, working with the DEA on the undercover operation down in Nicaragua, and spending the first half of 1985 again running undercover operations for the DEA, testifying against drug dealers, cartel members, and even Turks and Caicos officials, the judge in Florida, Norman Rutger, sentenced Seal to time served and 3 years probation in October of 1985. Barry Seal was almost a free man. When Louisiana authorities got word that Barry had only been sentenced to probation, they were upset. The Louisiana authorities had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars investigating Barry Seal, and they didn't want to come away empty-handed. They expected the judge in Florida to keep his initial sentencing.
The type of settlement that I wanted to reach, whether they're happy or not, you'll have to ask them.
You pleading guilty?
Yeah, I'm pleading guilty.
You going to serve any time?
I don't think so.
That the sentence will not be reduced. And as a result, he will serve 10 years, or the appropriate portion of that under the parole guideline.
What do you base that view on?
Just based on prior experience. I just have a feeling that he's not in a position, he's got no reason to change it.
Unfortunately for Seal, there was still a six-figure contract on his head from the cartel, and despite offers to enroll in the witness protection program, he declined because he didn't want to be away from his family and felt secure enough in Baton Rouge where he had hired bodyguards. On December 20th, 1985, the Associated Press runs a bombshell article written by Brian Barger and Robert Perry, linking the Nicaraguan Contras to the drug trade. That morning, Barry Seal goes for final sentencing in the Louisiana case. He expects essentially nothing to change, thanks to the existing agreement between Louisiana and Florida authorities. But Louisiana federal judge Frank Palazzola didn't see Seal as favorably as the judge in Florida did, saying, "Drug dealers like Mr. Seal are the lowest, most despicable people I can think of." Then he sentenced Seal to probation, a $35,000 fine, restricted travel, and most surprisingly, 6 months at a public Salvation Army halfway house, and says that if Seal was to have armed bodyguards, he could be in violation of his probation and charged with a crime. Seal asked him why if the bodyguards have legal permits to carry their weapons. Palazzola responds with,
"You take your chance, Mr. Seal."
Seal's Baton Rouge attorney, Louis Unglesby, tried to get Judge Palazzola to reconsider.
We begged him to let him go somewhere else. Florida. We had an arrangement for him to go to Florida, where they thought he would be safe. He thought he would be safe. Wouldn't be known exactly where he was.
Judge Palazzola said no.
Didn't want to hear about it.
He said it was only going to be for 6 months, and that he could handle that. He'd be okay for that 6 months. He was worried about them breaking his probation. He knew that was was a possibility, but he thought he could do the 6 months with ease.
On February 9th, 1986, Barry arrives at the Salvation Army halfway house in Baton Rouge around 6 p.m. like he had for the past 2 weeks. According to his secretary, that day Barry was busy trying to find a way to get the Playboy channel in the halfway house for all the guys staying there. As he parked his car in the halfway house parking lot, 2 men armed with a MAC-10 submachine gun opened fire on Barry Seal's car, killing him instantly.
Did they advise you and the court in private session prior to his sentencing that if he were placed in the Salvation Army that his life would most certainly be in jeopardy?
They probably did.
There are many widespread theories and allegations against the cartel and the CIA regarding the killing of Barry Seal. The most popular being that inside Seal's trunk the day he was killed contained George H.W. Bush's personal phone number. This is hard to verify as the content of his trunk was immediately confiscated by the FBI, according to Louisiana police that were on the scene. After his death, Barry Seal's lawyer, Louis Unglesby, allegedly told Richard Sharpstein, a lawyer that was representing one of the Colombians that was involved in Barry Seal's murder, that Unglesby had once got into an argument with Barry because he felt he wasn't being completely open about his dealings. Unglesby said Barry placed a phone call to Vice President Bush directly and argued with him, saying, "If you don't get these IRS assholes off my back, I'm going to blow the whistle on the Contra scheme." 3 weeks later, he was dead. Richard Sharpstein argued that his client and his co-conspirators were simply acting as soldiers, being directed by Colonel Oliver North, a staff member on the National Security Council during the Reagan administration, a man who would soon become the face of the Iran-Contra affair. We will probably never know the full truth regarding Barry Seal, but what we do know is that even after his death, the operations involving Barry didn't suddenly stop.
Their worst terrorists, the Red Brigades. The Sandinistas have even involved themselves in the international drug trade. I know every American parent concerned about the drug problem will be outraged to learn that top Nicaraguan government officials are deeply involved in drug trafficking. This picture, secretly taken at a military airfield outside Managua, shows Federico Vaughn, a top aide to one of the 9 commandantes who rule Nicaragua, loading an aircraft with illegal narcotics bound for the United States. No, there seems to be no crime to which the Sandinistas will not stoop. This is an outlaw regime.
Most of what President Reagan just said is not true. The airfield outside Managua is not a military airfield. It's a civilian airfield that has an area for military planes. But the real problem is how he addresses Federico Vaughn. Vaughn is the smoking gun that directly links the Sandinista officials to drug trafficking. The problem is, the only thing linking Vaughn to the Sandinistas is Barry Seal. The federal prosecutor in Miami said there was no further evidence outside of Barry Seal's words that Vaughn was an aide to a government official. The Nicaraguan Sandinista government themselves came out and said Frederico Vaughn worked as a manager for an export company run by the government, but had left years before the covert operation took place and was never an aide to any government official. The DEA later admitted that they didn't even suspect the Sandinistas of drug trafficking. And most strangely, the phone number for Frederico Vaughn traced back to a house rented out by the United States Embassy. And critics even then were alleging that the CIA set up the Frederico connection in order to discredit the Sandinista government. While this is impossible to prove, if Barry Seal wasn't working with the CIA, then he managed to not only fool the CIA, but the DEA and the White House, all to avoid a 10-year prison sentence. On October 5th, 1986, a C-123 aircraft gets shot down over the Nicaraguan jungle by Sandinista forces. One man parachutes out of the plane. Among the wreckage, military equipment, including rifles and explosives, are found. The lone survivor, Eugene Hasenfoss, confesses to being there under contract for the CIA to supply the Contras with weapons and supplies. The CIA initially denies all involvement. A photograph of Hasenfoss, surrounded by Sandinista soldiers, quickly gets international attention. This image served as a visual confirmation of the covert U.S. efforts to support the Contra rebels. And as it would turn out, the plane that was shot down that day over Nicaragua was Barry Seal's beloved Fat Lady. 1 month later, a Lebanese magazine publishes a bombshell report uncovering that the Reagan administration had secretly been selling arms to Iran in direct violation of an official embargo. The secret arms sale was aiming to do two things: facilitate the release of American hostages held in Lebanon and generate untraceable funds to support the Contras down in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration hoped to use the proceeds from these sales to circumvent the Boland Amendment. If Congress didn't know about the sales to begin with, they wouldn't ask about the money. 3 weeks after the magazine's release, Attorney General Edwin Meese holds a press conference where he confirms for the first time publicly that money from that arms sale was diverted down to the Nicaraguan Contras.
Certain monies were taken and made available to the forces in Central America opposing the Sandinista government there.
How much money, sir?
We don't know the exact amount yet. Our estimate is that it is somewhere between $10 and $30 million.
The same day, Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter, resigns amid the scrutiny, and President Reagan fires Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who had just spent the last few days shredding enough important documents he broke the government shredder. In April 1987, the CBS program West 57th airs an episode that sheds light on John Hull's farm and his alleged connection to the Iran-Contra affair. Before this program aired, John Hull was relatively unknown. He was an American expat farmer living in Costa Rica, where he owned a large farm near the Nicaraguan border. Hull's farm reportedly served as a crucial operational base for Contra rebels fighting the Nicaraguan Sandinista government, with allegations that his ranch was being used for arm and drug smuggling. For several years, the local press down in Costa Rica had identified Hull as a CIA liaison to the Nicaraguan rebels. John Hull was working directly for the CIA, had been since the early 70s, and was Oliver North's direct connection to the Nicaraguan Contras. John Hull laughed at these accusations, but was there any other evidence to suggest that there was a CIA connection down in Nicaragua relating to the Contras? Well, you've probably seen this clip.
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
But I doubt you've seen this one.
We have a gentleman down in Nicaragua who is on contract to the CIA, advising supposedly on military tactics, the Contras.
Well, Mr. President, you are implying then that the CIA in Nicaragua is directing the Contras there.
I'm afraid I misspoke when I said a CIA head in Nicaragua. There's not someone there directing all of this activity.
In May 1987, congressional hearings begin, aiming to delve deeper into the Iran-Contra affair. Former CIA Director William Casey, who's implicated in the scandal, dies the first day of the hearings. These hearings, broadcasted nationally, bring to light the intricate details of the secretive U.S. operations. Witnesses, including key figures from the Reagan administration, testify over the course of several months. The most notable of these testimonies is from Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who made several statements that that were highly controversial and contributed significantly to Iran-Contra's notoriety. He admitted under oath to misleading Congress, destroying evidence and falsifying records to hide the administration's support for the Nicaraguan rebels.
That's why the government of the United States gave me a shredder.
But your job...
And famously declared, "I lied every time I met the Iranians." On the 25th day of congressional hearings, 2 protesters from Baltimore began shouting, "Ask about the cocaine."
Not to let the ship in.
They were both fined $200. During the congressional hearings, Oliver North also admitted that in the months leading up to the Iran-Contra scandal, he was telling his friends that the Reagan administration was getting ready to use him as the fall guy. And fall he did. Under immunity, Oliver North took the blame for almost everything involving the scandal, absolving both Reagan and Vice President Bush of any significant fault. And because of the nationwide notoriety that his testimony garnered, his subsequent criminal conviction was overturned because it was impossible for him to get a fair trial. It wouldn't be until North's 1991 memoir when he finally asserted that President Reagan was fully aware of the Iran-Contra operations, a revelation that came way too late to alter the narrative. It also wouldn't be until 1993 that North's personal notebooks were finally made public. While heavily censored, the notebooks revealed many things. Most importantly, several references to a Freddie Vaughn, including a July 6, 1984 entry, Freddie coming in late July. This entry, just 11 days after Barry Seal went on a sting operation and captured photos of an apparent Sandinista official loading cocaine onto his airplane named Frederico Vaughn. Following the reversal of Oliver North's conviction and Vice President Bush's ascension to the presidency, the legal consequences for those implicated were presidential pardon, presidential pardon, presidential pardon, presidential pardon, presidential pardon, conviction overturned, granted immunity, presidential pardon, and probation. The only significant player in the Iran-Contra affair that served any time at all was Thomas G. Clines, a CIA officer that was sentenced to 16 months in prison for tax evasion. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh noted that there was a pattern of deception and obstruction by Bush and other senior Reagan administration officials. And in issuing the pardons, President Bush appeared to have been preempting being implicated himself by evidence that might come to light during subsequent trials. Now that everybody was pardoned, whatever evidence there was that Bush was involved disappeared.
This is your brain. This is drugs.
3 weeks after the Iran-Contra hearings were wrapping up, another scandal was brewing down in Bill Clinton's Arkansas. 2 hours east of the Mena airport, the bodies of Don Henry and Kevin Ives are hit by a freight train around 4:25 a.m. The train crew had attempted to stop the train, but were unable to before colliding with the bodies. By 4:40 a.m., police and emergency services arrive on the scene. EMTs note that the condition of the blood suggested it had deoxygenated, leading them to conclude that the boys had likely died prior to the train's impact. The official cause of death, ruled by state medical examiner Fahmy Malik, was accidental death as a result of marijuana intoxication, saying the boys had smoked the equivalent of 20 marijuana cigarettes and fell asleep on the train tracks. Before he had ruled the deaths accidental, he had also alleged that the boys may have purposely laid down in front of the train. The parents of the boys were a little skeptical, especially given that the train crew had spotted the boys more than 100 feet out and had began blaring its air horn. Dr. Malik had a history of giving strange rulings, including one instance where he ruled a decapitated man's death as natural causes due to complications with a stomach ulcer. When no head was found at the scene, Dr. Malik said the man's dog ate his head. Dr. Malik said he tested the dog's vomit and found pieces of the man's brain and skull. The head was later found in a trash can a few blocks away. Another instance was when a woman had been hit in the face with a piece of concrete after yelling racial slurs and throwing a beer can at a black man, died during her reconstructive surgery. The concrete had damaged her teeth and nose, but didn't cause any life-threatening injuries. During the surgery, however, the nurse anesthetist had issues transferring breathing tubes, causing the woman to lose oxygen, ultimately leading to a heart attack. Dr. Malik ruled this death a homicide by blunt force trauma, leading to the man that threw the concrete being tried for murder and exonerating the nurse from any malpractice. That nurse was Bill Clinton's mother, The families of the boys hire additional personnel to get a second opinion, as well as a private investigator to find out what really happened to their children. The private investigator would just end up being stonewalled by local authorities. A second autopsy, conducted by a forensic pathologist, however, revealed that the THC levels in the boys was likely the result of one marijuana cigarette, and also that the boys had multiple injuries unrelated to the train. Kevin's body had head injuries that matched the butt end of a rifle, and Don's body had multiple stab wounds in his back which matched markings on his shirt. The forensic pathologist added that Dr. Malik had destroyed the boy's body so badly during his initial autopsy that they could have had additional injuries, saying, "I've performed thousands of autopsies and have never seen anything like this." A former employee at the crime lab that worked on the original autopsy told reporters he mentioned the stab wound to Dr. Malik and was told, quote, "Don't worry about it." Media coverage on Malik's botched autopsy and strange rulings led to a massive public outcry calling him to be removed from office. Bill Clinton defended Malik by saying Malik was overworked and underpaid. Malik got a raise. Prosecutor Dan Harmon and his assistant prosecutor Richard Garrett reached out to the boys' families, promising to find whoever was responsible for the boys' murders. Dan Harmon had managed to convince Judge John Cole to appoint him as special prosecutor on the grand jury investigation into the boys' murders. During the grand jury investigation, 2 of the murder witnesses were themselves murdered. One, Keith McCaskill, told his story to assistant prosecutor Richard Garrett, and after telling his story, reportedly told his friends and family leading up to his death that he suspected he would be the next victim because he, quote, "knew too much." He was stabbed 115 times. Richard Garrett said he believed Keith's death was just a coincidence and didn't have anything to do with the boys they found on the tracks. Ultimately, the grand jury was brought to a close on the last day of 1988, with nobody charged, along with all evidence and reports being suppressed. In total, 6 witnesses would end up being killed that year in Arkansas. And after years of independent investigations and new officials coming in trying to investigate but constantly getting stonewalled and threatened, the cover-up of the boys' murders slowly begins to unravel. Russell Welch provides John Brown, a new detective who was investigating the boys' murders, with an audio tape, testimony from a confidential informant, saying the boys' murders may have something to do with the continued drug smuggling operations out of Mena, Arkansas, over a year after the death of Barry Seal. Residents in and around Alexander, Arkansas, had been complaining to local police about low-flying planes in the area at nighttime. Detective Brown managed to conduct interviews with 4 pilots who all alleged that the location of drug drops in that area of Arkansas was the same area of the railroad track these boys were murdered on. Brown also interviewed Charlene Wilson. Wilson was arguably the most important witness in this entire case. A witness so important that prosecutor Dan Harmon tried to stop her from interviewing with several different investigators, and even at one point allegedly planted drugs on her and got her sent to prison. Wilson alleges the night of the murders, herself along with a group led by prosecutor Dan Harmon were on the railroad tracks looking for a drug drop when they came across the boys who were also there curious about what was being dropped off by planes. She claims Dan Harmon and the group confronted the boys, who ran away to a local grocery store not far from the tracks. Witnesses from the grocery store parking lot that night claim a police cruiser pulled up and officers began beating the boys while forcing them into the back of the cruiser. The officers brought the boys back to the railroad tracks, already dead. And that's when Dan Harmon and the group began the cover-up. Wilson also claims, unrelated to the murders, that Dan Harmon was a personal friend to Bill Clinton, and she went with him once to the governor's mansion in Little Rock, Arkansas, for a cocaine-fueled sex party with Bill Clinton and his brother Roger. While this might be exaggerated, Wilson was known by investigators to be reliable, and Bill Clinton's brother Roger had already been convicted of cocaine trafficking. To this day, nobody has ever been charged for what happened to these boys. There are thousands of FBI, as well as CIA and DEA documents on these murders, which is pretty strange for a local homicide. Dan Harmon later was arrested and charged with racketeering, extortion, drug conspiracy, and distribution charges, underscoring just how corrupt he was. While the rise of interest in true crime has helped these boys' murders gain widespread attention, very rarely do those interested delve deeper into the intricate web of drug smuggling in Arkansas. Kevin Ives' mother, Linda, is largely the reason we know about this story. She died 2 years ago, never seeing anyone held accountable for the death of her son and his friend. In 1988, Senator John Kerry of Massachusetts led a committee essentially tasked with investigating the ties between drug trafficking, the CIA, and the Nicaraguan Contras. On the 4th day of hearings about drugs in Central America, the first witness to testify was
Mr. Gary Betzner.
Gary Wayne Betzner.
The very same Gary Betzner that jumped off that bridge in Arkansas 11 years before. Gary had faked his death, hypnotized his wife into believing he was dead, and had begun a new life smuggling cocaine. Betzner had begun flying cocaine for a George Morales in the early 80s and had become very close with Pablo Escobar, to this day calling Pablo a good man. In May of 1983, George Morales calls Gary and asks to meet him at his airport hangar. When Gary arrives, he's met with an official from the CIA. The CIA agent, who's apparently friends with George, orders Betzner to fly down to a military airport in Boca Chica. When he arrives, U.S. government officials load Gary's airplane with grenade launchers and ship mines that he is then ordered to fly down to Nicaragua, where it's offloaded by U.S. military personnel. What happened with those ship mines?
The Sandinista government is claiming the ports there are under siege.
Growing tension this morning between Nicaragua and the United States.
Who knows? In late 1983, Gary would end up retiring, taking his millions and moving down to Hawaii. But less than a year later, Gary gets a call from his old friend, George Morales. George tells Gary that he had been arrested and ended up cutting a deal with the CIA. George was to help the CIA move weapons down to the Nicaraguan Contras, and in exchange, he'd get out of his indictment. Gary, who considered George a genuine friend, agrees to help him get out of his indictment by flying these CIA weapons down to Costa Rica. When Gary and his co-pilot land at the designated runway, they're greeted by John Hull.
John Hull.
John Hull. John Hull.
John Hull.
All of a sudden, all roads led to John Hull.
Betzner testifies that after dropping the guns off at John Hull's farm, his plane was then loaded with 500 kilos of cocaine.
Estimated street value is 10 million.
Which he then brought back to the Opa-locka airport in Miami. Upon arriving at Opa-locka, he's met with police and other agents that turn their back as he steals 20 of the kilos for himself, gets in his Honda, and drives away.
Wasn't my cocaine. Wasn't George's cocaine.
In 1989, the Kerry Committee publishes their final report detailing substantial evidence of drug trafficking by the Contra rebels and concluded that U.S. government officials were not only aware of the drug operations, but in some cases hindered investigations and prosecutions of drug traffickers within the Contra support network. The committee uncovered evidence of Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega's covert support for the Contras and his ties to cocaine traffickers, much of which would later be used to justify the U.S. invasion of Panama later that year, as well as one witness on record alleging CIA agents themselves were directly involved in loading cocaine onto airplanes. The report also pointed to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North as the individual who leaked details of Barry Seal's undercover sting operation to the media. While the committee led to significant revelations, it didn't result in any criminal charges against anybody. However, just 10 days after the report, John Hull was arrested by Costa Rican authorities on several offenses, including drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and potentially being involved in terrorist activities due to his alleged participation in planning attacks against the Nicaraguan government. He got out on bail and fled the country. And just like that, this chapter in American history is closed. No significant arrest followed. Those implicated either faced minimal consequences or were shielded by presidential pardons. In MENA, investigators Russell Welch and William Duncan worked closely to compile substantial evidence linking drug trafficking to government operations, including evidence that Attorney General Edwin Meese had received a several $100,000 bribe from Barry Seal directly. They were stifled at every turn and eventually faced the harsh reality that truth was just too dangerous of a commodity to unearth. Russell Welch was also poisoned with anthrax. All of their work, culminating from a decade of investigation, became footnotes in a saga marked by an absence of accountability. While crack cocaine tightened its grip on the nation, the very system meant to protect American citizens had turned its back, leaving only the scars of a scandal so purposefully convoluted it discouraged questioning.
This is your brain on drugs.
On August 18th, 1996, the San Jose Mercury News publishes the first installment of a three-part series entitled Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion. For the better part of a decade, a San Francisco Bay Area drug ring sold tons of cocaine to the Crip and Blood street gangs of Los Angeles and funneled millions in drug profits to a Latin American guerrilla army run by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. This drug network opened the first pipeline between Colombia's cocaine cartels in the black neighborhoods of Los Angeles, a city now known as the crack capital of the world. The cocaine that flooded in helped spark a crack explosion in urban America and provided the cash and connections needed for LA's gangs to buy automatic weapons. These 3 sentences, along with an accompanying graphic depicting the CIA emblem over a crack pipe, led to an explosion of public outrage, especially within African American communities directly affected by the crack epidemic. The article, which was simultaneously published in print and online, written by Pulitzer Prize-winning Gary Webb, has been credited for furthering the internet's reputation as a powerful information medium, as well as introducing many to the internet for the first time due to widespread interest in the story. The story proved that Nicaraguan exiles and Contra sympathizers supplied Freeway Ricky Ross, the most notorious crack dealer in LA, with massive amounts of cocaine, and that some of those profits from these drug deals, totaling in the millions, helped the CIA fight communism down in Central America. The idea that the US government was somehow responsible for introducing crack to inner cities wasn't new. The New York Times had surveyed more than 1,000 black residents about this theory 6 years before Dark Alliance was released, and over a quarter of those surveyed said they believed the US government deliberately makes drugs easily accessible in poor black neighborhoods in order to harm black citizens. That, along with the fact that much of the reason street gangs and violence rose to such prominence in the 80s and 90s was directly due to control over drug territories, it's not hard to see how someone could come to that conclusion. And Gary Webb's Dark Alliance confirmed that for many, even though Gary himself came out and said that's not what he believed, and that's not what he was trying to sell his story as. Gary Webb didn't believe the US government was even remotely capable of a grand conspiracy such as this, but that didn't matter. In September, Newsweek devotes an entire page to the story. Time magazine calls it the hottest topic in Black America. 60 Minutes and Dateline fight over who gets to interview Webb first, and Jerry Springer, Geraldo Rivera, Tom Snyder, Jesse Jackson, Montel Williams, CNN, C-SPAN, MSNBC, and CBS Morning News were all asking to interview Webb. The story started making international headlines, with the London Times and Le Monde in Paris writing stories about Webb's reporting. Newspapers in Germany, Belgium, Spain, Colombia, and Nicaragua all reach out to Webb for interviews. And NBC News, inspired by Webb's reporting, finally does an expose on the drug-related entries in Oliver North's diary. Meanwhile, the establishment papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times, remained largely silent. Speaking about Dark Alliance, journalist Robert Perry said the strange thing was that after Webb's story appeared, the major newspapers pretended that they had already covered the story, and that the CIA had already admitted the Contras were involved in drug trafficking. But that's not how they reported the story at the time, when they were busy mocking Senator John Kerry as a conspiracy buff. On October 3rd, 1996, the Washington Post publishes the story, "The CIA and Crack. Evidence is lacking of an alleged plot," written by Walter Pincus and Roberto Soro. The article cites mostly unnamed sources, claiming that Webb's reporting was wrong about the amount of cocaine distributed and the amount of money that had been given back to the Contras. This article cherry-picked statements by Blandón to support this idea. Pincus and Soro ultimately agreed that the CIA was aware of drug trafficking and did nothing to stop it, but they conveniently neglect to account for the 1986 LA County Sheriff's record cited by Webb that would disprove the testimony from their unnamed sources. Pincus and Soro also falsely claimed that Gary's reporting made a racially charged allegation that the Contras deliberately targeted the black community in an effort to expand the market for a cheap form of cocaine. To say the least, the Washington Post article was slightly biased. But maybe that's because 30 years earlier, on a 1967 edition of the Washington Post, there's another article written by Walter Pincus, "How I Traveled Abroad on CIA Subsidy." It tells the story of how Pincus was recruited by the CIA when he was in college to spy on student groups at several conferences in between the 1950s and early 60s. The same journalist that was tapped to debunk Gary Webb's story about the CIA's involvement in the crack epidemic had himself worked as a CIA operative and had a history of writing articles that seemed to be in favor of the CIA. 3 weeks after the Washington Post response to Webb's story, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times both run lengthy stories attempting to debunk Dark Alliance. Both papers admit that a lot of the basic facts were true. Drug money was sent to the Contras by Blandón and Meneses, but in the tens of thousands, not millions, according to unnamed sources. They also both correctly claim that while Gary and his editors might have believed Blandón and Meneses sparked the crack cocaine epidemic, this was impossible to prove. The LA Times in particular had dedicated 17 reporters to this one story, and this was the best that they could come up with. They also spent a considerable amount of time pondering whether or not black people were more prone to believing in conspiracy theories. An internal CIA memo that wouldn't be declassified until 2014 detailed how they used their relationship with key figures at multiple major news outlets to contain the Dark Alliance story. In late October of 1996, the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence begins hearings on the Contra drug allegations. While not really leading to anything substantial, the CIA Inspector General promises that the CIA will conduct an internal review that will provide an answer to all of Webb's allegations. Throughout the latter half of 1996 and early 97, Gary Webb would continue to investigate this story. But the more he found, the harder the backlash would be, especially from his own paper, the Mercury News. On May 11, 1997, the Mercury News ran a column from its top editor, Jerry Seppos, essentially apologizing for minor inaccuracies in Webb's reporting. It accused Webb of leaving out contradictory information, of failing to emphasize that the multi-million-dollar figure was an estimate, and of not including the obligatory denials of the CIA. It didn't, however, point out that a lot of the inaccuracies were actually the fault of the editors themselves, who, when Gary first drafted Dark Alliance, wanted him to lean harder into the CIA angle, and had removed bits of Blandon's testimony from Gary's original story that would later be used by the Washington Post to undermine Dark Alliance. Seppos' column was basically Seppos washing his hands of minor inaccuracies. It was far from a total retraction of the Dark Alliance story, but that's what other newspapers sold it as, so that's what it was universally received as. Dark Alliance, as well as Gary Webb, was now publicly viewed as discredited. It was now open season on Gary Webb. The CIA-backed Contra drug smuggling ring was no longer the focus. The reporter who broke the story, with a few minor inaccuracies, was. At the New York Times, reporter Ivor Peterson wrote a scathing article on Webb's entire career. Peterson went back into Webb's history and dug up 2 libel suits filed as a result of Webb's reporting that ended in settlements. Peterson used this to paint Webb as a journalist that had a history of playing loose with the facts. Peterson didn't mention that these lawsuits were filed because of sensationalist headlines on Webb's stories. Webb's reporting in the stories was entirely accurate. Webb had written 4 follow-up stories to Dark Alliance that the Mercury News was refusing to publish. At the time, Webb was also getting offers from several major publications to write a book detailing all of the evidence he found in regards to his Dark Alliance series. Jerry Seppos said if Gary wanted to write a book, he'd have to resign first. Gary Webb resigned from the newspaper on November 19, 1997. After hearing about his resignation, Robert Perry wrote Gary Webb a letter of condolence. Like you, I grew up in this business thinking our job was to really tell the public the truth. But something very bad happened to the news media in the 1980s. Part of it was the public diplomacy pressures from the outside, but part of it was the smug, snotty, sophomoric crowd that came to dominate the national media from the inside. These characters fell in love with their power to define reality, not their responsibility to uncover the facts. By the 1990s, the media had become the monster. Less than a week after the Mercury News announced Gary Webb's resignation, the CIA finally responded to the allegations in a truly genius fashion. Instead of finally releasing that internal investigation, they leaked the conclusions of that report, a summary, to the LA Times and the Mercury News. Although the reporters had no actual idea what the CIA report said, the CIA finds itself not guilty was quite the triumphant headline to those looking to discredit Dark Alliance. It actually wouldn't be until 2 months later, in January of '98, when the media was busy obsessing over President Bill Clinton's White House mouth hugs, that the unredacted version of the report was released. The report detailed how the CIA did in fact know the dealings of Norman Menezes, directly intervened in drug trafficking cases to prevent the public from learning of the relationship between CIA assets and cocaine traffickers, and once even asked the Justice Department to return money it had confiscated from known drug traffickers so it could be sent back to the Nicaraguan Contras. The major newspapers didn't report on almost any of this. When the CIA finally admitted it had worked with and protected from prosecution Nicaraguan Contra drug traffickers, it wasn't a big deal. But the question remained, how did so many CIA assets get away with drug trafficking for so long if the CIA wasn't in some way facilitating their drug operations? In March, the CIA Inspector General appeared before the House Intelligence Committee to update Congress on the CIA's findings. There, he reveals that he neglected to interview many key individuals in the scandal, admits the CIA continued relationships with those they suspected of drug trafficking, and admitted that in 1982, the CIA worked out a deal with the Reagan administration so they no longer had to report any non-staff employees for allegations of drug trafficking, meaning if CIA contract pilots, operatives, or assets were involved in cocaine trafficking, no one needed to know. That deal lasted until 1995. Now that deal wouldn't cover CIA officers, people that get W-2s from the CIA, but thankfully for the CIA, they never found evidence of one of their officers dealing drugs, except for that one time they did. In October, the CIA finally releases Volume 2 of the full 600-page report. On October 13th, 5 days after the report's release, Congresswoman Maxine Waters inserts into the congressional record allegations that an appendix to this report was removed at the instruction of the Department of Justice at the last minute. This appendix is reported to have information about a CIA officer, not agent, not asset, but officer, based in Los Angeles, who was in charge of Contra-related activities, running drugs to South Central Los Angeles around 1988. That appendix was never found, never really mentioned again, and every time someone discusses CIA drug running, they'd never bring it up. What would be the smoking gun proving the CIA was involved directly in the crack epidemic was quite literally ripped out of history. A month later, in November of '98, Gary Webb would release his own book, Dark Alliance. Even though the book is a great response, Webb's detailed documentation and the subsequent confirmations of his finding by many others would not be enough to change the mainstream narrative crafted about the crack epidemic and the CIA's involvement. The book received far less coverage than the articles. Even the Mercury News refused to review it. In the end, only C-SPAN would help to promote the release of the book on television, where Gary came on and talked about Dark Alliance, as well as other headlines that morning.
Or we back off of the story and it goes away, and what they decided to do was back off of it and go, and similar to what happened with the CNN Tailwind story, pursuing it would have created a huge controversy.
There's a story on the front page below the fold in the Washington edition of the LA Times that profiles the Saudi dissident who you referred to, Hosami bin Laden, how he turned against the Americans essentially as a result of Operation Desert Storm in 1990.
Well, there was a very interesting book written a couple of years ago by a journalist named Jonathan Quitney. It was called Endless Enemies. And his theory was that the United States foreign policy simply creates enemies wherever we go. And I think this is another example. When we intervene in the affairs of other countries and we shoot at people and people get shot at with American bullets and American weapons, we create enemies. And if this is true, that this man turned against the United States government as a result of Desert Storm, we've created another enemy there we might not have had before.
On December 10th, 2004, after having to sell his home because he could no longer afford the mortgage, Gary Webb packed his belongings, mailed letters to his family, watched his favorite movie, listened to his favorite album, left his driver's license next to his bed so that nobody would have to identify his body, and shot himself twice in the head. The initial report of his death caused people to immediately theorize it was the CIA or some other government agency that assassinated him in response to the Dark Alliance story. When it was clarified that there was no foul play suspected, that didn't stop the rumors from spreading. This image and the theory that Gary Webb was assassinated unintentionally worked to undermine the truth that the US government, working with the combined resources and influence of the three most powerful newspapers in America, orchestrated a campaign to shatter the life and career of a single journalist to the extent that it caused that man years later to take his own life. In the wake of his death, he would continue to be attacked by newspapers, such as the LA Times labeling him as a discredited journalist during his obituary. When the story of Webb was being told in the 2014 film Kill the Messenger, Washington Post assistant editor Jeffrey Lean took it upon himself to get out ahead of any empathy the film might garner, writing Gary Webb was no journalism hero. Despite what Kill the Messenger says, the Hollywood version of his story, a truth teller persecuted by the cowardly and craven mainstream media, is pure fiction. In the words of Gary Webb, whether it's through premeditated murder or manslaughter, does not change the fact that you have a body on the floor, regardless of how you spin it. The CIA was complicit in the distribution of cocaine to fund the Nicaraguan Contras. The American government, working directly with drug traffickers, allowed the streets of America to be flooded with crack cocaine, leading to the destruction of America's inner cities, and worked with major media companies to destroy the life of the journalist that threatened to expose this information.
Any questions?
And allowing drug dealers access to selling drugs in the United States so that money can be funneled into their military. Right.
This is a smoking cannon that leads all the way to the White House.
We have no evidence
of a conspiracy by the CIA to engage in encouraging drug traffickers.
I am going to make somebody pay for what they have done to my community and to my people.
Don't give me a conspiracy. There has never been a conspiracy.
Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson says he is running for president in 2024.
The number of so-called cocaine babies is growing at an astonishing rate.
The number of babies born addicted has risen more than 500%.